She left the 2-carat diamond necklace on the mahogany vanity, kicked off her $3,000 stilettos, and climbed out the third-floor window. What she didn't know was that the man she was running from wasn't waiting at the altar. He was sitting quietly in the estate's security hub, a glass of scotch in hand, watching her white dress billow in the freezing wind on camera 4. He didn't sound the alarm. He just watched her run. And then he smiled. Rose stared at the stranger in the mirror. The woman looking back was buried under 50 pounds of hand-stitched Italian silk. Her ribs ached against a corset, pulled tight enough to bruise bone. Her blonde hair was pinned into an immaculate immobile sculpture, secured by dozens of jeweled grips that dug into her scalp. She looked like a very expensive, fragile cake topper. She felt like a hostage. Downstairs, 200 guests were drinking vintage champagne on her father's dime, or rather on Gabriel's dime. Her father Richard didn't have dimes anymore. He had crippling gambling debts, a failing shipping company, and a daughter who had just been traded to the head of the city's most brutal syndicate in exchange for a clean ledger and intact kneecaps. Love was a fairy tale for people who didn't owe $2 million to the mob. For Rose, marriage was simply a transaction, a foreclosure. Rose placed her hands flat on the vanity. The marble was freezing against her sweaty palms. 10 minutes! Her mother had chirped 5 minutes ago before shutting the heavy oak door. Her mother's eyes had been wide with a frantic, pleading terror. Just touch up your powder, sweetheart. Don't keep him waiting. Rose's gaze dropped to the side table. A velvet sewing kit sat open, left behind by the tailor who had made last-minute alterations that morning. Resting beside a spool of white thread was a pair of heavy silver shears. They were long, industrial, and razor-sharp. She picked them up. The metal was cold. She didn't hesitate. She didn't give herself the time to think about the consequences. Rose grabbed the voluminous layers of tulle and silk at her waist, pulled the fabric taut, and drove the shears in. The heavy material resisted for a second before giving way with a sickening, satisfying tear. Rose hacked at the dress. She cut away the sprawling 6-foot train. She slashed violently through the heavy, restrictive underskirts until the gown fell unevenly just below her knees. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps, echoing loudly in the quiet suite. It wasn't a dress anymore. It was a jagged, ruined rag. But it was light. She could move. She stepped out of the white stilettos. She would snap her ankles trying to run in 3-inch heels. She walked to the window and unlatched the heavy brass lock. She pushed the pane up. A rush of damp, freezing night air hit her face, carrying the smell of wet asphalt car exhaust and impending rain. It was a filthy, gritty smell. It was the best thing she had ever breathed. Rose swung one bare foot over the sill, her toes finding the rusted iron grate of the old fire escape. The rough metal bit instantly into her soft skin. She pulled herself through the window frame, the cold wind immediately cutting through the ruined silk of her bodice. She shivered violently, her bare shoulders exposed to the late November chill. 3 stories down. The alleyway below was dark, illuminated only by the faint, sickly orange glow of a distant street lamp. She started to climb. The iron stairs were slick with condensation. Her bare feet slapped softly against the freezing metal. Rust flaked off the railings onto her palms, smelling sharp and metallic like old blood. She slipped on the second landing. Her knee slammed hard into the iron grating. Pain shot up her thigh, sharp and blinding. She bit her lip hard enough to taste copper, swallowing a scream that burned in her throat. No noise. Just keep moving. The fire escape ended abruptly, leaving a 10-foot drop to the alley floor. She lowered herself, hanging from the bottom rung. Her arms trembled violently under her own weight. Her shoulders screamed in protest. She closed her eyes and let go. She hit the pavement hard, her bare feet taking the initial shock before she collapsed, rolling into a pile of discarded damp cardboard boxes to break her fall. The impact knocked the breath completely out of her lungs. She lay there for 3 agonizing seconds, gasping for air, staring up at the narrow strip of black, starless sky, caught between the looming brick buildings. She was out. Rose scrambled to her feet. Her knee throbbed with a dull, heavy ache, and the soles of her feet were already black with city grime. She didn't look back at the brightly illuminated window of the bridal suite. She just ran a jagged white ghost disappearing into the shadows of the alley, moving blindly toward the deafening hum of the city. Gabriel sat in the dark. The estate's security room hummed with the quiet electrical buzz of 40 flat-screen monitors, painting his sharp features in a harsh, pale blue light. He sat relaxed in a leather swivel chair, slowly swirling the amber liquid in his heavy crystal glass. The ice clinked softly, a rhythmic, calming sound in the dead quiet of the room. "Boss," Cole said. His voice was a low, rough rumble, tight with sudden tension. Cole stood by the main console, his massive hand hovering instinctively over the red lockdown button that would seal the estate's reinforced gates. Gabriel raised a single finger. Wait. On monitor, 4 Rose was hanging from the fire escape. Even through the grainy, green-tinted night vision feed, Gabriel could see the sheer, desperate strain in her arms. He watched her drop. He watched her hit the ground, roll through the garbage and stumble to her feet. He watched the ruined, hacked-up remains of the $500,000 dress he had paid for flutter around her bruised thighs as she sprinted toward the main avenue. "She's heading south on 5th. Cole stated, his eyes locked on the changing screens. "I have 2 cars idling at the front gate. Say the word. We can have her back in the suite before the string quartet finishes their warm-up." Gabriel took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch. It burned going down, leaving a pleasant, grounding heat in his chest. "No," Gabriel said. His voice was quiet. It always was. He didn't need to shout to command a room. People had long ago learned to lean in when he spoke, terrified they might miss an order. Cole turned his head, his thick brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "Sir, let her run. The guests will drink my liquor and wait," Gabriel said. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the edge of the console. His dark eyes tracked Rose's tiny fleeing figure as she passed seamlessly from Camera 4's feed to Camera 7's. He felt a strange, entirely unfamiliar tightening in his chest. Amusement, respect. It had been a very long time since anyone had genuinely surprised Gabriel. He knew exactly what this marriage was. A transaction. Richard had essentially sold his only daughter to save his own skin and secure a lucrative shipping route. Gabriel had accepted the deal because it consolidated his hold on the southern docks, and because Rose had been quiet, compliant, boring. During their brief, heavily chaperoned dinners over the past month, she had sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed blankly on the tablecloth. She answered his questions with polite, hollow one-word answers. A porcelain doll, a necessary decorative asset. He had expected her to cry in the bridal suite today. He had expected her to resign herself to the cage he was building for her. He hadn't expected her to take a pair of shears to a designer gown and scale down a rusty fire escape barefoot in 30-degree weather. "She's fast," Cole muttered almost to himself, watching her clear a chain-link fence on Camera 9. "She's terrified," Gabriel corrected softly. "But she's using the fear. Look at her." On the screen, Rose was hugging the shadows deliberately, avoiding the harsh glare of the streetlights. She wasn't just running blindly in a panic. She was actively thinking, calculating. "Where is she going to go?" Cole asked, shaking his head. "She doesn't have a phone." I took her purse at the door this morning. She has no money, no ID. She has absolutely nothing. She thinks she has freedom, Gabriel murmured. He stood up slowly, buttoning his charcoal suit jacket. The expensive fabric pulled perfectly across his broad shoulders. Keep the perimeter guards in place. Send Marco and Elias out in unmarked cars. Tell them to keep a strict 2-block distance. If they touch her, if they even let her see them, I'll break their hands. I just want to know where she goes when she thinks no one is watching. Cole nodded, reaching for his radio. And you? I have a father-in-law to console, Gabriel said. A dark, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. Gabriel walked out of the security room and descended the sweeping grand staircase. The ballroom below was a sea of silk diamonds and nervous, buzzing energy. The low murmur of polite conversation died instantly the second his leather shoe hit the marble landing. 200 faces turned toward him in synchronized silence. He saw Richard standing near a massive swan ice sculpture, a crystal glass of champagne trembling violently in his sweaty grip. Gabriel walked slowly across the polished floor. The crowd parted for him, like water stepping back to give him a wide berth. The silence was absolute, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Gabriel's shoes. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of Richard. "Where is she?" Richard stammered. A bead of sweat traced a shiny path down his flushed, pudgy cheek. Is she coming down?" "There has been a slight delay," Gabriel said softly. His gaze locked onto Richard's, pinning the older man in place. "It seems the bride needed some fresh air." Richard's face drained of color, turning a sickly ashen gray. "Gabriel, I swear to God, if she—" "You don't need to swear to God. Richard." Gabriel interrupted his tone, perfectly conversational, but dripping with quiet, lethal menace. "You just need to stand here, smile at the photographers and drink your champagne. Your daughter and I have a long, prosperous life ahead of us. We're just adjusting the terms of our arrangement." Gabriel turned his back on the trembling man and walked purposefully toward the coat check. It was time to hunt. The rain started as a fine, freezing mist and quickly escalated into a heavy, unrelenting downpour. Rose shivered violently, her arms wrapped tight around her torso in a desperate attempt to conserve body heat. The hacked, jagged edges of the silk dress clung to her skin like wet, freezing paper. Her feet were bleeding. She had stepped on a jagged piece of broken beer bottle 3 blocks back, and now every single step sent a sharp, electrifying spike of agony shooting up her calf. She had crossed into the warehouse district. It was empty, dark, and aggressively industrial. Looming brick facades with smashed windows lined the streets. She needed clothes. She needed money. Most importantly, she needed to get off the street before Gabriel's men realized she was gone. She assumed they were already tearing the city apart looking for her. She pictured black SUVs, screeching around corners, armed men kicking in doors, shaking down her few friends. She had to hurry. Up ahead, a flickering, buzzing neon sign cut through the sheets of rain, Lucky's 24-hour wash. Rose pushed her weight against the heavy glass door. The blast of warm, aggressively humid air hit her frozen face like a physical blow. The laundromat smelled deeply of cheap bleach-wet dog and stale cigarette smoke. There was only one person inside, a teenage boy with dyed black hair, slumped asleep in a plastic chair while his clothes tumbled rhythmically in a dryer. Next to him, on an empty orange chair, sat a faded, oversized grey hoodie and a pair of worn-out canvas sneakers. Rose approached him quietly, her bare feet making wet, squeaking sounds on the linoleum. She reached up to her left ear and unclasped her diamond earring. It was real. Flawless. It was worth more than this entire dilapidated building. She gently placed the diamond on the boy's lap. He stirred slightly, muttering in his sleep, but didn't wake. Rose grabbed the hoodie and the shoes. She retreated quickly to the small, grimy bathroom in the back corner. She stripped off the heavy, soaking wet corset, leaving the ruined $1 million remains of Gabriel's wedding dress in a sodden, dirty heap next to a clogged toilet. She pulled the large grey hoodie over her head. It felt scratchy against her skin and smelled faintly of damp basement and cheap weed, but it was incredibly warm. It swallowed her small frame, hiding her completely. She laced up the canvas sneakers. They were 2 sizes too big, slipping off her heels, but they protected her bleeding raw soles. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror over the sink. Her elaborate bridal updo was a tangled, wet, chaotic mess. She aggressively pulled out the remaining bobby pins, letting her blonde hair fall in damp, heavy waves around her face. She pulled the large hood up over her head. She wasn't a Mafia bride anymore. She was just a girl on the street. A ghost. Rose slipped out the back door of the laundromat into a dark, trash-filled alley. The main Greyhound station was only a mile away. If she could pawn the remaining earring or find a desperate clerk willing to take a bribe, she could buy a ticket to nowhere. Just get on a bus. Anywhere that wasn't this city. Anywhere that wasn't Gabriel. She walked fast, keeping her head down, hugging the brick walls. The relentless rain masked the tears of pain and exhaustion that were finally starting to spill over her eyelashes. The bus terminal was a cavernous, depressing monument to transit. Harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights illuminated the cracked tile floors. Drifters slept on rigid plastic benches, clutching their bags. The air smelled of stale coffee, wet wool, and desperation. Rose joined the short line at the ticket counter. She unclasped her remaining earring, clutching it so tightly in her fist that the sharp backing dug into her palm. She stepped up to the thick plexiglass window. When is the next bus out? Anywhere far? Out of state? She asked, her voice raspy and shaking. The clerk, an older woman with thick, smudged glasses, barely looked up from her glowing green monitor. Detroit, 20 minutes. Gate 4, $45. I don't have cash, Rose said, leaning closer to the glass, dropping her voice to a desperate whisper. She slid the diamond earring under the metal slot. This is a real diamond. It's worth at least $2,000. Keep it. Just print me a ticket. The clerk frowned heavily, picking up the diamond with 2 fingers. She looked at it, squinting against the harsh light. Then she looked up at Rose. But her eyes didn't stop on Rose's face. They shifted slightly. She looked past Rose's shoulder. Rose froze. The hair on the back of her neck stood straight up. A primal survival instinct, sharp and entirely undeniable, flared violently in her chest. She didn't turn her head. She didn't move a muscle. She just shifted her eyes, looking at the reflective surface of the thick plexiglass, separating her from the clerk. Behind her, standing near the main entrance, sliding doors, was a man in a tailored black suit. He wasn't doing anything aggressive. He was just casually reading a newspaper. But he was wearing a $2,000 suit at 2 a.m. in a decrepit Greyhound station. And he had a small coiled wire snaking down from his right ear into his collar. Rose slowly shifted her gaze to the left reflection. Another man. Black leather jacket, standing idly by the vending machines. He wasn't looking at the candy. He was looking right at the back of her head. They hadn't lost her. They had been with her the entire time. Panic seized her throat, a cold iron grip choking off her air. They weren't grabbing her. They weren't dragging her into a car. They were herding her, playing with her, letting her exhaust herself, letting her think she had a chance just to watch her fail. "Keep it," Rose whispered to the clerk, abandoning the diamond on the counter. She turned and walked. She didn't run. Running would trigger a chase, and she couldn't outrun them. She walked briskly toward the side exit, pushing through the heavy glass doors back out into the freezing, punishing rain. She turned blindly down a side street, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She needed to hide. She needed a crowd, a distraction, anything, but the streets were totally dead. Half a block ahead, the warm yellow glow of an all-night diner spilled out onto the slick, wet pavement. The neon sign flickered, Mel's Diner. Rose crossed the street, her oversized shoes splashing heavily in the deep, oily puddles. She pushed open the glass door. The bell above it chimed a cheerful, inappropriately bright sound that mocked her terror. The diner was entirely empty, except for an old cook scraping a greasy flat-top grill in the back. Rose walked straight toward the furthest booth in the back corner. She kept her head down, wanting only to slide into the dark vinyl curl into a ball and disappear from the world. She kept her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor, her breathing shallow and ragged. She reached the booth and slid in, letting out a long, shuddering exhale. The greasy warmth of the diner began to seep into her frozen bones, making her shiver even harder. A heavy white porcelain coffee cup slid smoothly across the laminate table, stopping perfectly in front of her. Steam rose from the pitch-black liquid. "You look cold." Rose's blood turned to absolute ice. The voice was smooth quiet and carried a heavy gravitational weight that seemed to instantly crush all the air out of the room. She slowly raised her head, her trembling hands pushing her wet hood back. Gabriel was sitting across from her in the booth. He wasn't wet. His dark hair was perfectly immaculately styled. His charcoal suit was completely dry. He sat with one arm resting casually on the back of the red vinyl seat, looking at her with eyes that were blacker and colder than the night outside. "Drink," he said softly, gesturing to the steaming cup with a slight nod of his head. "It's going to be a long ride home." Rose stared at the black coffee. Steam curled off the surface, disappearing into the cold, greasy air of the diner. Her hands were shaking so violently that if she tried to lift the porcelain mug, she would spill the boiling liquid all over her lap. She looked back up at Gabriel. He hadn't moved. He sat perfectly still, a predator entirely at rest, his dark eyes locked onto her face. There was no anger in his expression, no triumphant smirk. He simply looked at her the way a scientist might observe a rat navigating a particularly complex maze. "You let me run," Rose said. Her voice was a cracked, raspy whisper. Her throat burned with the effort of speaking. "I did," Gabriel replied smoothly. "Why? To see how far you would get." Gabriel leaned back against the vinyl booth, steepling his fingers. "And to let you exhaust the fantasy. If I had my men pull you off that fire escape, you would have spent the next 5 years of your life planning another exit. You would have looked at every open door, every cracked window, wondering if you could make it. Now you know." He gestured to the window. Outside, the freezing rain continued to lash against the glass, distorting the streetlights into ugly yellow smears. "You have no money. You have no allies. You can't outrun me in my own city. The fantasy is dead, Rose. Drink your coffee." Rose's jaw tightened. A hot, furious spike of adrenaline pierced through her exhaustion. She wanted to throw the scalding coffee into his face. She wanted to scream. But she was painfully aware of the black SUV idling at the curb outside, and the 2 massive men in tailored suits standing beneath the diner's awning, the rain completely ignoring them. She wrapped her freezing hands around the mug. The heat sapped into her skin, painfully reviving the circulation in her stiff fingers. She brought the rim to her lips and took a sip. It was bitter burnt and black. She swallowed it down. "Good," Gabriel said softly. He stood up, dropping a crisp $100 bill onto the laminate table. "Let's go home." Rose didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. She slid out of the booth, her oversized canvas sneakers squeaking against the floor. As she put her weight on her left foot, a sharp, blinding pain shot from her heel straight up to her hip. She stumbled, her knee buckling. Gabriel's hand caught her elbow before she hit the floor. His grip was like a vice, impersonal, unyielding, and incredibly strong. He didn't pull her up gently. He hoisted her upright, supporting her weight without breaking a sweat. I stepped on glass. Rose muttered, hating the tremor of weakness in her voice. She tried to pull her arm away, but his fingers didn't budge. "I know," Gabriel said. He didn't offer a shoulder to lean on. He simply kept his iron grip on her arm, forcing her to match his steady, deliberate pace as he walked her out of the diner and into the storm. Cole opened the rear door of the SUV. The interior was a cavern of black leather and dark-tinted glass. The heat was blasting. Rose climbed in, collapsing against the far side of the back seat, pulling her damp, foul-smelling hoodie tight around her chest. Gabriel slid in beside her, the door shutting with a heavy, pressurized thud that sealed out the noise of the rain and the city. The engine roared to life. The SUV pulled away from the curb. The silence in the car was suffocating. The only sound was the rhythmic, hypnotic sweeping of the windshield wipers. Rose pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching the dark, rain-slicked streets blur past. The adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow. Her eyelids felt heavy, filled with sand. Her muscles ached with a deep, throbbing intensity. Gabriel opened a compartment in the center console. He pulled out a thick, folded white towel and tossed it onto her lap. "Dry your hair. You're ruining the leather," he said. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the back of Cole's headrest. Rose stared at the towel. It was heavy, soft, and completely dry. She slowly lifted it, draping it over her wet, tangled hair, scrubbing the freezing moisture from her scalp. She didn't say thank you. He hadn't given it to her out of kindness. He just didn't want his upholstery stained with alleyway grime. The wedding. Rose finally croaked the word, tasting like ash in her mouth. "My father." The reception was beautiful. Gabriel interrupted smoothly, still not looking at her. The guests enjoyed the catering. Your father drank heavily and sweating profusely through his tuxedo. A very standard evening. We didn't say vows. Gabriel finally turned his head. In the dim passing light of the street lamps, his face looked carved from stone. "We signed the legal bindings yesterday morning in your father's study. The ceremony tonight was a public spectacle. It was theater. You were my wife the moment the ink dried. Running out a window didn't annul the contract, Rose. It just ruined a very expensive dress." Rose squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the hot, humiliating prickle of tears. He had her. He had always had her. The SUV did not return to the sprawling historic estate where the wedding had taken place. Instead, it drove deep into the northern hills, winding up a steep private road, completely shielded by towering ancient pines. The vehicle slowed as it approached a massive sliding steel gate, built seamlessly into a 12-foot-high stone wall. Cameras tracked their approach. The gate rolled open silently, revealing a sprawling, ultra-modern architectural monolith of glass-black steel and slate. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a highly classified compound. The car stopped under a wide portico. Cole opened the door. Rose climbed out, wincing violently as her left foot hit the pavement. She limped behind Gabriel, entirely dwarfed by the towering glass doors that slid open as they approached. The interior was stark minimalist and aggressively clean. Floors of polished concrete stretched out beneath vaulted ceilings. The lighting was low and indirect. There were no family portraits, no warm rugs, no signs of human life. It was a sterile, beautiful vault. "Take her to the East Wing." Room 4. Gabriel ordered, handing his wetsuit jacket to a silent man in a black shirt waiting in the foyer. "Tell Hayes to meet her there." He didn't look back at Rose. He simply walked away, disappearing down a long, shadowed corridor. A woman in her 50s, dressed in plain, dark clothes, stepped forward. "Mum, follow me, please." Rose followed. They walked down a wide hallway, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over a dark, churning infinity pool and the city lights miles below. The housekeeper opened a heavy oak door and stepped aside. Rose walked in. The bedroom was massive. A king-sized bed dominated the center of the room, draped in heavy charcoal linens. A fire was already crackling in a gas fireplace, built into a slate wall. The adjoining bathroom was entirely done in black marble, featuring a massive soaking tub. It was luxurious. It was flawless. It was a cell. "There are fresh clothes in the closet," the housekeeper said quietly. "Dr. Hayes will be here momentarily." She pulled the heavy door shut. The lock engaged with a loud, definitive click. Rose exhaled a shaky breath. She walked toward the bathroom, intending to peel off the damp, disgusting hoodie, but a knock at the door stopped her. The lock clicked open. A tall, thin man carrying a black leather medical bag stepped into the room. He had kind, tired eyes and graying hair. "Mrs. Rossi, I'm Dr. Hayes." Hearing Gabriel's last name attached to her own made Rose's stomach physically churn. She nodded tightly, sitting on the edge of the large bed. "Gabriel tells me you had a disagreement with some broken glass," Hayes said gently, setting his bag on a side table. He didn't ask questions. He didn't ask why the bride was wearing a filthy, oversized sweatshirt and canvas sneakers. He clearly knew exactly who he worked for, and survival meant minding his own business. He knelt on the floor and gently removed her left shoe. The sole of her foot was a mess of dried blood-streaked dirt and raw, blistered skin. A jagged shard of green glass was embedded deep in her heel. "This is going to sting," Hayes warned, pulling a pair of metal tweezers and a bottle of iodine from his bag. Before he could touch her, the bedroom door opened again. Gabriel walked in. He had changed out of his suit and was now wearing dark slacks and a black, fitted crewneck sweater. He walked to the corner of the room, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest. Rose stiffened. She hated that he was here. She hated that he was watching her bleed. "Proceed, Hayes," Gabriel murmured. The doctor gripped her heel firmly. Rose clamped her teeth together, digging her fingernails into the charcoal duvet. The tweezers pinched, gripped, and pulled. A sharp, searing line of fire ripped through her foot. She gasped, her body instinctively jerking backward, but Hayes held her foot perfectly still. He pulled the glass free and dropped it into a metal tray with a sharp clink. He immediately soaked a gauze pad in iodine and pressed it hard into the open wound. Rose squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back a whimper. "You have a high pain tolerance," Gabriel observed from the shadows. "I grew up with Richard." Rose snapped the pain, sharpening her tongue. "You learned to take a hit." Gabriel's eyes narrowed slightly, a microscopic shift in his stoic expression. He watched Hayes bandage her foot with swift, practiced efficiency. "Keep it elevated," Hayes instructed, packing his bag. "Stay off it for 48 hours. I'll leave antibiotics on the counter. Take them." Hayes left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Gabriel remained leaning against the wall. The silence stretched between them, heavy and loaded. Rose refused to look at him. She stared stubbornly at her heavily bandaged foot. "Get some sleep," Gabriel finally said, his voice quiet. "You have free reign of the house, with the exception of the basement level. The perimeter is heavily guarded. The gates require biometric clearance. If you try to run again, you won't make it to the trees." "I'm not going to run," Rose said, her voice flat and entirely hollow. Gabriel pushed off the wall. He paused at the door, his hand resting on the heavy brass handle. Good, because the next time you leave this property, I won't be watching you on a monitor. I'll be beside you. He stepped out, and the lock engaged once more. Rose sat alone in the massive, silent room. The fire cracked in the hearth. She was safe, she was warm, and she was entirely trapped. Rose woke up to the smell of rain and fresh coffee. Her body felt like it had been hit by a freight train. Every muscle ached, a deep, residual soreness from the sheer physical trauma of the climb, the drop, and the miles of desperate barefoot running. She pushed the heavy duvet off and sat up. Her left foot throbbed a dull, rhythmic pulse against the tight white bandages. She looked at the bedside table. A steaming thermos of black coffee sat next to a small white bottle of pills. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed and limped to the closet. The housekeeper hadn't lied. The closet was stocked, but it wasn't filled with the designer dresses, diamonds, and sheer silk lingerie a Mafia boss usually bought for a trophy wife. The racks were filled with functional high-quality basics, thick cashmere sweaters, tailored dark denim, sturdy flat leather boots. It was clothing for a woman who lived in a fortress, not a doll in a display case. Rose dressed in a thick black sweater and soft grey trousers. She swallowed 2 antibiotics with a sip of hot coffee, wincing at the bitterness. She needed to know the layout of this cage. She needed to know the exact dimensions of her prison. She opened her bedroom door. It was unlocked. She stepped out into the wide, sunlit hallway. The storm had passed, leaving the morning sky a pale, washed-out blue. The house was dead quiet. She walked slowly, favoring her right leg, her bare right foot, padding silently against the polished concrete floor. She passed a massive chef's kitchen, entirely empty. She passed a sunken living room with a sprawling U-shaped sectional and a wall of bookshelves. No guards, no maids. It was as if the house had swallowed the staff whole. At the end of the main corridor, heavy double doors stood slightly ajar. Rose hesitated. Gabriel had said she had free rein, but instinct told her this was a test. She pushed the door open an inch and slipped inside. It was an office. The room was dark, panelled in heavy mahogany, smelling strongly of old paper leather and the faint, lingering scent of scotch. A massive desk dominated the space, covered in neat, organized stacks of manila folders and ledgers. Rose limped toward the desk. Her heart began to hammer, a familiar, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She shouldn't be here. She should turn around and go back to the bedroom. But the need to understand why she was here, why Gabriel had accepted her as payment, overrode her fear. Richard owed Gabriel $2 million. Gabriel was worth hundreds of millions. The debt was a rounding error. So why demand the daughter? She reached the desk and looked down at the open ledger resting on the green leather blotting pad. It wasn't a financial ledger. It was a thick dossier. And stamped in bold black letters across the top tab was her father's name, Richard Vane. Rose glanced at the door. Silence. She flipped the folder open. Her eyes darted across the pages, scanning the columns of text-printed photographs and bank routing numbers. The first few pages were what she expected. Gambling debts, failed investments, a massive bleed of capital from Richard's shipping company. But as she turned the pages, the narrative shifted. There were transcripts of phone calls, emails printed and highlighted in yellow. Richard hadn't just lost Gabriel's money. He had been actively selling Gabriel's shipping manifests, cargo schedules, and port security codes to a rival syndicate, the Costello family, the men who controlled the northern borders. Richard had been playing both sides, acting as an informant, trying to leverage Gabriel's roots to buy his way out of debt with the Costellos. He was a rat. Rose felt the blood drain entirely from her face. The room suddenly felt freezing cold. The mob didn't forgive rats. They didn't repossess their houses or break their knees. They put them in the ground. They wiped out their bloodlines to send a message. Yet Richard was alive. He had been sweating through his tuxedo at her wedding last night. He sold me out for a seat at the Castello table. Rose spun around her heart, leaping into her throat. Gabriel was standing in the doorway. He was holding a ceramic coffee mug, dressed in a crisp white dress shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He didn't look angry that she was going through his private files. He looked entirely unsurprised. "How long have you been standing there?" Rose breathed, taking a small step back from the desk. "Long enough to let you read the important parts," Gabriel said, stepping into the room and closing the heavy double doors behind him. The click of the latch sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He walked slowly toward the desk. Rose gripped the edge of the mahogany wood, bracing herself. "Your father is a traitor, Rose," Gabriel said smoothly, rounding the desk to stand merely feet away from her. "He stole from me. He gave my enemies the schedules of 3 cargo ships, carrying $20 million in untraceable assets. Under the rules of my business, he should have been bleeding out in a trunk 3 weeks ago." "Then why isn't he?" Rose asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it steady. Gabriel looked down at her. His dark eyes were bottomless, impossible to read. "Because a dead man can't manage a port. The Castellos trust him. If I kill him, they scatter. If I keep him alive, he becomes my asset inside their operation. He feeds them the information I want them to have." Rose's mind raced, piecing the brutal logic together. "He's a double agent. You're forcing him to feed them bad intel." "Exactly. Then what do you need me for?" Rose demanded. "If you already own him, if you already have the leverage, why the marriage? Why bring me here?" Gabriel leaned against the edge of the desk, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at her, truly, looked at her for a long, silent moment. "Because a rat is a rat," Gabriel said quietly, his voice carrying a lethal, quiet gravity. "Your father has no loyalty to anyone but himself. If the Castellos offered him enough money, he would turn on me again in a heartbeat." Gabriel reached out his long, calloused fingers, gently tapping the open dossier on the desk. He needed a reason to stay perfectly, flawlessly loyal to me. Gabriel continued, his eyes drifting up to meet hers. He needed to know that if he ever lies to me, if he ever misses a call, if he ever even thinks about betraying me again. Gabriel didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The realization hit Rose with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed out of her lungs. Her knees felt weak. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't a prize. She was a hostage. "Your collateral," Gabriel confirmed, reading the dawning horror on her face. "As long as you are in my bed, wearing my ring, breathing my air, Richard will do exactly as he is told. He knows that his daughter's life is entirely dependent on his good behavior." Rose stared at the man standing in front of her. The cold, brutal mechanics of his world were laid bare. Her father had sold her to save his own skin, and this man had bought her to ensure a return on his investment. "And if he slips up?" Rose asked, her voice a hollow, ghostly whisper. "If he betrays you again?" Gabriel took a sip of his coffee. He looked at her over the rim of the mug, his expression completely void of emotion. "Then you and I will have a very brief, very unpleasant conversation, Rose." Rose did not flinch. She stood in the quiet, mahogany-paneled office and looked at the man who held her life in a ledger. Her father had sold her. Gabriel had bought her. The math was brutally simple, and for the first time in her 24 years, Rose finally understood the equation of her own existence. She slowly closed the file on the desk. The heavy cardstock made a dull thud against the leather blotting pad. "Then you better hope he is a better liar than he is a father," Rose said. Her voice was steady. The tremor was gone. The raw, bleeding panic that had propelled her out of a third-story window had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard ash. Gabriel's hand paused on the handle of his coffee mug. He tilted his head, a microscopic shift of his chin, studying her with a sharp, renewed intensity. He had expected tears. He had expected a hysterical collapse, a litany of pleas, or a sudden, violent outburst of denial. He hadn't expected pragmatism. "He's highly motivated," Gabriel replied smoothly, setting the mug down. "Fear is a phenomenal teacher." "And what am I supposed to do?" Rose asked. She crossed her arms, ignoring the dull ache in her left foot. "Sit in that bedroom for the next 20 years, wait for a phone call telling me my father missed a deadline, and it's time for my unpleasant conversation." "You are my wife," Gabriel said. He stepped away from the desk, moving toward the massive window overlooking the compound's rear perimeter. "You will eat at my table. You will attend the events I require you to attend. You will maintain the absolute illusion of a sudden, quiet marriage. What you do with the rest of your hours in this house is entirely up to you." He didn't wait for a response. He walked out of the office, his footsteps fading down the long, polished corridor. Rose was left alone in the silence. The first week was an exercise in sensory deprivation. The house was a fortress of glass, steel, and silence. There were guards, but they were ghosts, men in dark suits, who stood at the perimeter gates or monitored the camera feeds in the basement. They never spoke to her. The housekeeper brought meals, cleaned, and disappeared. Rose spent the first 4 days sitting in the sunken living room, watching the rain batter the floor-to-ceiling windows. She waited for the panic to return. She waited for the crushing weight of her captivity to break her mind. It didn't. Instead, a strange, creeping sense of autonomy began to take root. Her father was not here. His gambling debts, his frantic phone calls, his suffocating, pathetic need for her to smile and appease his creditors, all of it was gone. She was trapped, but for the first time, she wasn't carrying Richard's baggage. Gabriel required nothing of her except her physical presence. By the second week, Rose stopped hiding in her bedroom. She began to map the house. She learned that the West Wing was purely functional, a commercial-grade gym, a sparring mat that smelled of sweat and canvas, and a heavy steel door that required a biometric scan to open. An armory, she assumed. She learned Gabriel's routine. He left the compound at 6 in the morning. He returned at 8 in the evening. Sometimes he didn't return for 2 days. When he was home, he spent his time in the mahogany office or the gym. They rarely crossed paths. On the evening of the 18th day, Rose walked into the massive stainless steel kitchen at 9 o'clock. The housekeeper was gone. The refrigerator was stocked with fresh produce cuts of prime meat and ingredients Rose had never had the time or money to learn how to cook. She pulled a heavy cast-iron skillet from the rack. She chopped onions, garlic, and heavy tomatoes. She focused on the mechanical rhythm of the knife against the heavy wooden board. The smell of searing oil and garlic filled the sterile, cold air of the house. "Hayes said you were supposed to stay off your feet." Rose paused, the knife hovering over a sprig of basil. She didn't jump. She had learned the subtle shift in the air pressure that accompanied Gabriel entering a room. She turned her head. He was standing in the doorway wearing a dark suit, his tie loosened. He looked exhausted. A faint smear of something dark and rusted blood, she realized with a cold jolt, stained the cuff of his white shirt. "My foot is fine," Rose said. She turned back to the cutting board, sweeping the basil into the skillet. It hissed violently. "And I was losing my mind." Gabriel walked into the kitchen. He didn't go to the sink to wash the blood off his sleeve. He walked to the island, pulling out one of the heavy steel bar stools, and sat down. He watched her. "You can cook," he observed. "My father's staff quit when I was 16 because he stopped paying them," Rose said, flatly stirring the heavy sauce. "I learned out of necessity. Do you want some?" It was a reflex, a strange domestic question lobbed into a bizarre lethal dynamic. Gabriel looked at the skillet, then up at her face. "Yes." Rose pulled down 2 ceramic plates. She served the pasta, sliding one plate across the marble island toward him. She took the stool opposite him, resting her elbows on the cold stone. They ate in silence. The only sound was the clink of silver forks against ceramic. It was the first time they had shared a meal without an audience, without a contract, without a gun to her father's head. "He called today," Gabriel said quietly, his eyes focused on his plate. Rose stopped chewing. She swallowed hard. "Richard." "Yes." He fed the Costellos a falsified shipping manifest for the southern docks. They moved 3 crews into position to intercept a shipment of narcotics that doesn't exist. Gabriel took a sip of his water. "The federal authorities will be waiting for them instead. Your father is proving to be a very competent asset." Rose looked at Gabriel's hands, large, calloused, capable of profound violence. "What happens when the Costellos figure out they've been set up?" she asked. "They will look for the leak," Gabriel replied. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "But Richard has covered his tracks. For now, you are safe." "I don't care if I'm safe," Rose said. The words slipped out before she could stop them. They were entirely true. "I care if I'm ever going to be anything other than a chess piece." Gabriel set his fork down. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the marble. "In my world, Rose, everyone is a piece on the board," he said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet rumble. "The only difference is whether you are a pawn or the player. You ran from your father's mess. You survived a 3-story drop and outsmarted my perimeter guards for exactly 45 minutes. That isn't pawn behavior." He stood up, leaving his plate half full. He looked down at her. "Figure out how to play, Rose, because the board is about to get very crowded." The rain returned on a Tuesday. It was a torrential, blinding downpour that turned the hills surrounding the compound into a slick, muddy nightmare. Rose was in the library. She had spent the last month reading through Gabriel's collection of historical biographies. She had learned not to ask questions about the black SUVs that came and went in the middle of the night, or the heavy metallic thuds that occasionally echoed from the basement. She lived in a bubble of silent observation. At 11:42 p.m. the power died. It wasn't a flicker. The house went instantly completely black. The low hum of the central heating system cut out, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake, broken only by the relentless drumming of a rain against the reinforced glass. Rose sat perfectly still in the leather armchair. She didn't breathe. 10 seconds later, the emergency backup generators kicked in, but the lights didn't return to full brightness. The house was bathed in a dull, sickly red glow, the emergency security lighting. An alarm began to blare. It wasn't a loud, piercing siren. It was a low, rhythmic, guttural pulse that vibrated through the floorboards. Intruder protocol. Rose stood up. Her bare feet felt the cold vibration of the wood floor. Gabriel was not home. He had left for the docks 3 hours ago with Cole and 4 other men. The house was lightly staffed. A sharp, crackling voice echoed from the intercom speaker mounted above the library door. "Perimeter breach at the north gate. Multiple hostiles. They've disabled the outer cameras. Lock down the east wing. Protect the asset." The asset. That was her. Rose didn't wait for the guards to come find her. If the north gate was breached, the attackers were already inside the compound's walls. The Costellos. They had figured it out. Richard's luck had run dry, and they had come for his daughter to send a message to Gabriel. She slipped out of the library and into the red-lit hallway. She didn't run toward her bedroom in the east wing. That was a dead end. A box. She ran toward the kitchen. A deafening crash echoed from the front of the house, the sound of reinforced glass shattering under extreme force. Gunfire erupted, rapid, deafening bursts that tore through the sterile silence of the compound. Rose dove behind the kitchen island just as heavy boots pounded into the main corridor. She pressed her back against the cold stainless steel cabinetry, pulling her knees to her chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a violent, frantic bird trapped in a cage. She reached up and blindly grabbed the handle of the nearest drawer. She pulled it open. Silverware. She blindly felt past the spoons and forks until her fingers wrapped around the thick, heavy handle of a carbon steel meat cleaver. "Check the east wing," a voice shouted. It wasn't a voice she recognized. It was rough-accented and out of breath. "Find the girl. The boss wants her breathing, but he didn't say she had to be walking." Footsteps moved past the kitchen entrance, heavy and fast, heading toward her bedroom. Rose gripped the cleaver with both hands. Her palms were slick with cold sweat. She couldn't stay here. When they found her bedroom empty, they would tear the house apart, room by room. She needed a blind spot. She crawled on her hands and knees, keeping her head below the level of the marble island. She made it to the pantry door, pushed it open, and slipped inside, pulling it shut behind her. It was pitch black, smelling of dried pasta and dark chocolate. More gunfire. Closer this time. The sound of a body hitting the floor out in the hallway. Rose squeezed her eyes shut. She thought of her father sitting in some smoky room, completely unaware that his daughter was clutching a kitchen knife in a dark pantry because of his cowardice. Anger, hot and blinding, cut through her terror. She wasn't going to die here for Richard Vane. The pantry door violently jerked open. The red emergency light spilled in. A man stood in the doorway. He was wearing tactical gear, his face obscured by a wet black balaclava. He held a suppressed submachine gun tight against his chest. He saw her. "Got her. Kitchen." He barked into a radio on his shoulder, raising his weapon. Rose didn't scream. She didn't cower. She let out a guttural, feral sound of pure rage and lunged forward, driving the meat cleaver upward with every ounce of strength in her body. The heavy steel blade bit deep into the man's thigh, right above the knee pad of his tactical trousers. He screamed a jagged, wet sound, and his leg buckled. His finger spasmed on the trigger. The gun fired a wild, deafening burst into the ceiling, raining plaster and dust down on them. He collapsed backward onto the kitchen floor, clutching his leg. Rose dropped the cleaver, scrambling out of the pantry. She slipped on a patch of the man's blood, her knee slamming into the hard tile, but she forced herself up. She ran blindly toward the rear service door. A second man stepped out from the dining room, blocking her path. He was massive, holding a handgun leveled directly at her chest. "Don't move!" he snarled. Rose froze. The air completely left her lungs. She looked at the black barrel of the gun. This was it. The end of the run. A shadow separated itself from the absolute darkness of the dining room corner. It moved with unnatural, terrifying speed. Before the man with the gun could pull the trigger, Gabriel was behind him. Gabriel's left arm wrapped violently around the man's throat, pulling him backward, instantly cutting off his air. In his right hand, Gabriel held a combat knife. He drove it into the side of the man's neck, a swift, brutal, mechanical motion. The man dropped his gun, his hands flying up to his throat. Gabriel twisted the blade and pulled it free. The man collapsed like a string-cut puppet, blood instantly pooling on the polished concrete floor in thick, dark rivers. Gabriel stepped over the body. He was breathing heavily. His suit jacket was gone, his white shirt soaked with rain and dark, smeared blood. His face was a mask of cold, absolute murder. He looked at Rose. He looked at her bare, blood-spattered legs. He looked at the frantic rise and fall of her chest. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer a gentle hand. He strode across the kitchen, grabbed her by the arm, and pulled her hard against his chest. He shoved her behind him, keeping his body positioned squarely between her and the hallway. "Hold on to my belt," Gabriel ordered. His voice was a low, guttural rasp. "Do not let go. If someone comes around that corner, I am going to shoot through them. Make sure you are behind me." Rose grabbed the thick leather of his belt. Her fingers were shaking so badly she could barely maintain a grip, but she held on. For the next 10 minutes, Rose lived in a nightmare of shadows, deafening noise, and the copper smell of blood. Gabriel moved through his own house like a predator clearing a den. He was utterly ruthless, neutralizing 3 more Costello gunmen with terrifying clinical efficiency. Finally, the front doors burst open, and Cole stormed in, flanked by a dozen heavily armed men. "Clear!" Cole roared, his massive frame dripping with rainwater. "Perimeter is secure. The stragglers are retreating into the trees. We have teams tracking them." Gabriel lowered his weapon. The tension slowly bled out of his shoulders. He turned around to face Rose. She was covered in plaster dust and blood that didn't belong to her. She was trembling violently, her eyes wide, staring at the carnage scattered across the floor of the beautiful sterile house. Gabriel reached out. His large hand, slick with blood, gently cupped the side of her face. His thumb brushed a streak of dirt from her cheekbone. The touch was shockingly soft. "You stabbed him," Gabriel murmured, his eyes locking onto hers. There was a raw, undeniable fire in his gaze. "I didn't have anywhere to run," Rose whispered, her voice cracking. Gabriel's jaw tightened. "You're never going to have to run again." The house smelled of bleach and ozone. It had been 3 days since the breach. The shattered glass had been replaced. The blood had been scrubbed from the concrete floors. The compound was quiet once more, but the silence felt entirely different. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of a cage. It felt like the eye of a hurricane. Rose stood by the window in the mahogany office, looking out at the tree line. The sun was setting, casting long, bleeding shadows across the manicured lawn. The heavy double doors opened. Gabriel walked in. He walked with a slight limp. A bullet had grazed his left hip during the final shootout in the foyer. He was dressed in a dark grey sweater and slacks, looking exhausted, the sharp lines of his face drawn tight with fatigue. He didn't go to his desk. He walked directly to a small side table and poured 2 glasses of scotch. He walked over to the window and handed one to Rose. She took it, letting her fingers brush against his. "Drink," he said quietly. Rose took a sip. The amber liquid burned beautifully down her throat, grounding her. Gabriel reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He held it out to her. "What is this?" Rose asked, not taking it. "A new passport. A bank account routed through a shell corporation in Switzerland containing $5 million. And a ticket to Geneva for tomorrow morning," Gabriel said. His voice was perfectly flat, void of any emotion. Rose stared at the envelope. Her heart gave a strange, painful lurch. "Why?" "Richard is dead," Gabriel stated. The words dropped into the quiet room like heavy stones. Rose didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She just stared at Gabriel's collarbone, absorbing the impact. The Costellos figured out he was playing them. Gabriel continued, his eyes fixed on the tree line outside. They didn't just come here to send a message. They hit him at his office downtown an hour before they breached my gates. They burned him alive. Rose closed her eyes. A complicated, sickening wave of grief and profound relief washed over her. The man who had sold her, the man who had traded her life for shipping routes, was gone. "The debt is nullified," Gabriel said softly. "The leverage is gone. You are no longer collateral, Rose. There is no strategic reason for you to remain in this house. The contract is void." He pushed the envelope closer to her chest. "Take it. Cole will drive you to the airstrip in the morning. You have your freedom." Rose looked at the thick paper envelope. It was everything she had wanted when she climbed out of that third-story window. It was a clean slate, an exit. No mobsters, no violence, no cages. She looked up at Gabriel. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring stubbornly out the window, his jaw clenched so tight the muscle ticked under his skin. He was letting her go, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his glass of scotch. He was a man who took whatever he wanted, and he was forcing himself to open the door and let her walk out. He wasn't just a monster. He was the only person who had ever told her the exact brutal truth. He had caught her when she fell. He had stood between her and a bullet. Rose slowly reached out. She didn't take the envelope. She put her hand flat over Gabriel's hand, pushing it gently back toward his chest. Gabriel froze. He finally turned his head, his dark, bottomless eyes locking onto hers wide with a sudden naked shock. "You let me run once," Rose said softly. Her voice was steady, resonant with absolute certainty. "I didn't get very far. It's cold out there." "Rose," Gabriel warned. His voice was a harsh, ragged whisper. "If you stay now, it's not a contract. It's not a transaction. I will pull you completely into this life. I will never let you leave." "I know." She stepped closer to him, closing the physical distance between them. The scent of him, clean soap gun oil and scotch enveloped her. "I'm done running," she said. Gabriel stared at her for one long, suspended second. Then he dropped the envelope onto the floor. His free hand caught the back of her neck, his fingers tangling roughly in her hair. He pulled her flush against his chest, his mouth crashing down onto hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was possessive bruising and desperate. It was the collision of two people who had survived the dark by learning how to see in it. Rose dropped her glass. It shattered on the floor, the scotch splashing over their shoes. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders, holding on to him as tightly as she had held onto his belt in the dark. She wasn't a hostage anymore. She was exactly where she chose to be. If Rose and Gabriel's twisted, thrilling journey kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Don't keep this story to yourself. Share this video with your fellow dark romance addicts. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our upcoming gritty, emotional audio dramas. The underworld is full of secrets, and we have so many more stories to tell. Hit subscribe and join the family.